Welcome to the Finding Danny Lightfoot podcast, where we explore the mystery of Joe Torres, who played Danny Lightfoot on Nickelodeon's Hey Dude. I am your host, Luke Pickard, with my longtime friend, John Kimball. Join us each episode as we explore clues, conduct interviews, and celebrate the legacy that was Hey Dude. Yippee-ki-yay, let's go. Welcome to episode 2 of Finding Danny Lightfoot, the podcast. Today is June the 22nd, 2024. My name is Luke Pickard, and I am here as always with my good friend, John.
Hi, everyone.
So before we get too far in it, what do you think about the new theme song, John?
I think it's the right balance of, nostalgia, which is obviously it's a big part of the show is based on our nostalgia for the show, but also the mystery and trying to figure it out.
Yep, exactly. And I'm glad you liked it. Thank you for those kind words. Let's start by talking about what I alluded to last week, the fact that I have actually reached out to someone about the Finding Danny Lightfoot project. So several years ago, when I was in efforts to create a documentary, I reached out to David Lascher through Twitter at the time to see if he would be interested in potentially helping with that project. He did respond when I asked him if he would be interested in working with me on a project, but he asked me what kind of project, and when I proceeded to tell him, he proceeded to not respond. So that is the big mystery. So I hope I did not disappoint anyone. The first topic is going to be about something I discovered last week while I was doing some research for the podcast. I actually discovered on a wiki page that there was actually a book about Hey Dude that came out in '92 called The Showdown at Bar None. The story mainly corresponds to the plot of season 3 premiere Inmates Run the Asylum.
That's the one where Ted's supposed to be in charge, but he makes a bunch of crazy rules and they end up going against Ted. I think Buddy's helping Ted. Let's see.
Was this book written by someone affiliated with the show? Because it makes it sound like it is, but
Yeah, it's it looks like an official thing. You can get it for about $12 on eBay.
That's pretty funny considering I really can't even get people to take books for me for free at a garage sale. Granted, they aren't Hey Dude books, but still. Maybe the show was way more popular than I thought, because if they made a book, maybe the plan was to make an entire book series out of the show.
Yeah, they do a book for every episode or whatever, but I guess it didn't sell that well. I didn't even know about it. They didn't even hit their two biggest Hey Dude fans.
So aside from the book, John found a podcast that was very relevant.
Yeah, so after we put out our first episode, a listener notified me that there is an existing podcast called Hey Dude, the 90's called, and it's hosted by Christine Taylor, who played Melody on Hey Dude, and David Lascher, who played Ted on Hey Dude. And it's not solely focused on Hey Dude. It's from the title, you can kind of tell it's a 90's podcast. But when I found out about it, I kind of started looking through the episodes and I found they did a Q&A, and it struck my mind that maybe that could be something. I clicked on the Q&A description and it teased basically that they would be discussing the mystery of Joe Torres. And this came out, I think, in June of last year or something, maybe about a year ago. And it was very interesting because both Christine Taylor and David Lascher expressed that they really want to know where Joe is and that they don't know where Joe is. And they discussed some efforts made by, I think, a producer on their podcast to get in touch with Joe. And it had gotten as far as talking to someone who claimed to be a second cousin of Joe. And the message that she got back is that this thing that we've heard kind of repeated, but never really confirmed, that Joe doesn't want to revisit Hey Dude and that part of his life. He just doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to come out publicly. And, we've talked about that being a possibility. At this point, I don't think we have any kind of confirmation that that's actually true. We just have some secondhand, maybe even third-hand kind of reports
From people who may not even know Joe Torres.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It was interesting. I was thinking this podcast, Hey Dude, it's the 90's, how excited my younger self would have been by the idea of this podcast by Christine and David Lascher, where they at least sometimes talk about Hey Dude, which we've talked about how we have these strong memories of the show and really enjoyed the show, and there wasn't a lot of discussion about it, in mainstream media or anything like that. So seeing their podcast made me excited. Christine also mentioned that there's another podcast called Yay Dude that's kind of a rewatch podcast where they go back through all the different episodes of Hey Dude and talk about them. And
Oh, that's
um,
cool.
is worth a listen for big fans of the show as well. But I really the short version of all that is that at least two members of the Hey Dude cast don't know where Joe is and want to know where Joe is. And I think that both of those things are big steps toward this mystery finally being solved. So that's some good news.
Yeah, and it seems to correspond with how they were on the 25-year reunion several years ago because they were certainly reluctant to talk about Joe Torres and where he was. So fans are left to take from that silence that either they couldn't speak about where he was or didn't want to, or they just really didn't know, which, if it's the latter, that would make sense here. They also have podcasts. I'm just curious. So they have a Hey Q&A Part 2, which I think is the one that you initially told me about, right? Or was that Part 1?
No, it's in part one. I don't think it's addressed in the second one. I'm pretty sure I listened to the second one. I also listened to a couple of their other episodes where they had Kelly Brown on.
Yeah.
They had Jonathan Galkin, who played Jake, on, and they had David Brisbane, who played Benjamin Ernst, on, and they also had a writer. And I was interested to learn Graham Yost, who wrote a bunch of episodes of Hey Dude, while he was working on Hey Dude, wrote the screenplay for the movie Speed, which obviously became a huge, enormous financial success. And he went on to write on Band of Brothers and all these other things. So it's interesting to see someone who came from what could be dismissed as like a pretty silly kids show to have this long career writing critically acclaimed screenplays and things like that. So that was another interesting tidbit that I picked up from listening to those episodes.
That's crazy. That I would have never guessed that anybody affiliated with the show Hey Dude would have written Speed. But that's amazing
Right.
for
And
him.
writing it while he was down there in the Tucson area filming the show and writing the show. So
It's crazy.
very
He
interesting
must have had a lot of
how
time.
directly it ties in. Yeah. Yeah.
So Christine and David have also interviewed several people from the 90s, and one of the guys who I've spoken to about our podcast suggested that maybe we could do that after the conclusion of our podcast to go and search for other 90s celebrities that have sort of fallen off since the height of their popularity. But it looks like these guys, they're on top of it and they've already done some of that. So that's cool.
I mean, I thought about that too. Like, assuming we find Joe Torres and are ready to move on to another subject. But I think that's kind of the point of why this subject is so interesting. There aren't a lot of similar examples. I can't think of
Yeah.
any, and of someone who is that prominent on a show that was that popular, and no one knows anything about where they are.
Yeah. Oh, they had Mark Summers on the podcast.
Oh,
I
they
need to
did.
listen to that episode. Yeah.
Yeah, I've listened to a few episodes of it and would definitely recommend it to anyone who's looking for a nostalgic podcast about the 90s with a particular emphasis on Hey Dude.
So one thing you had asked me to do is to go back and watch the first episode again. And I did that. And I know you did that probably more intently than I did. I just listened to it, headed back from work today. Um, it's exactly a 30-minute drive, so it was perfect for the episode. The only thing I picked up, and I'll let you talk about your stuff, was the first shot actually is of Ted coming in on the back of a truck, and he gets out of the truck and thanks the driver and then says, "Hey Joe," which I didn't realize that was a common expression, but now that I think about it, and I think you pointed it out, maybe that's just something that he said, like Hendrix and everybody else. I didn't know that was a thing, but that was
Yeah.
awfully interesting, given the situation with Joe Torres. But what else did you pick up from that episode?
What I was thinking with this is that We aren't a rewatch podcast. I talked about there is one apparently called Yay Dude, and if you're interested in that, that seems like it's a really good version of that podcast. But we're left in this situation where we're looking for this person, Joe Torres, and we're trying to figure out what we can about this person. And really all there is are these episodes of Hey Dude. And it also crossed my mind, like Danny is a very um identifiable character. He has all these characteristics that we have identified on the past podcast, and we'll surely talk more about as we go forward. Um, but a lot of times, the actor who portrays a character kind of imbues some of himself or herself into that role. And that's kind of what I was thinking with this, is that maybe we go back and we revisit not all the episodes, obviously, but some of the episodes, some of the Danny centric episodes, and we kind of see what we can learn about the man Joe Torres from his
Through the character.
portrayal of Danny Lightfoot. Yeah. And that reminds me, one other thing, before we kind of dive into this is, Christine Taylor made a sort of offhand comment, that Joe wasn't an actor. So I found that kind of interesting. I don't
Yeah,
know how he
that's
ended up getting cast in the show, but she at least said that he wasn't an actor.
that would
So
be a great topic if we could find who the cast director was for this to sort of see the story of how they came to find Joe and how they ended up coordinating that. That would give us a lot of insight as to maybe why, if he does want to stay out of the limelight, why he does. Maybe he just had a pretty good life
mhm.
before and just doesn't care anything about it. Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting. And another thing too is you mentioned, I don't know if this was on the podcast or not, about him being the Hopi Indian and not really being certain that he was. Do we know
Mhm.
for sure that he was or not? Because if what you're saying is true, and I think it is, and he does portray some of himself through his character, that would lead credence to, or lend credence to, his actually being Native American.
Yeah. And I just don't know. I don't know. People online for a long time have said he was not, but I don't know what any of that's based on. And there's obviously the stuff we talked about last time where maybe his actual name is Jose Torres. But again, it's just people on the internet. It's hard to know if anyone is basing anything on something factual or if they're just typing on the internet. But the first episode, you're right, Ted arrives first in the back of a pickup truck. And then they contrast that with Brad arriving in a limo. And this idea, Ted thinks she must be a rich guest, but immediately setting her up as a privileged background and contrasting that with Ted, who hitched a ride with some local in the back of a pickup truck. At least that's the implication. And then, then before the opening credits roll, Ted falls into a water trough, which is like, I was thinking as I was watching this, I wonder how many times over the course of the 65 episodes or however many of them Ted was in, Ted falls into a water trough. It was like such a gag that
Yeah,
they went back to time and time again. So yeah, I can tell you he falls into a water trough 2 times in the first episode, but probably at least 30 or 40 times over the course of the whole series.
that's funny. It makes me wonder if they actually just shot it one time and replay the same shot over and over again. We'll have to go back and see if he was wearing the same clothes or if it's the same shot,
Right, right.
or if it's a
Could
different
very
shot
well
every
be.
time.
Or if David Lascher was like, "Look, I'm not doing that again." Just pull the footage from the last episode. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the theme song plays right after that. The theme song is just extremely good and catchy. And I don't know if anybody that remembers the show remembers the theme song, probably.
It has a bit of an
And then,
AI vibe in it. Like I was listening to it today and like that voice, it doesn't necessarily
oh yeah,
sound like a person. It almost sounds like a computer digital voice. Maybe it's just a filter or something, but I remember that and I was like, man, this sounds like maybe they were ahead of their time in terms of the AI aspect.
yeah. I mean, that's interesting. And there's also like another thing that um, feels a little AI is every time you ever hear the phrase "yippee ki yay," it's with a K a sound,
Yeah.
and it's definitely "yippee ki yay" in the They Do theme song. I don't know if they just didn't know the correct phrasing or what, but it's distinct, right? There's no way I can't hear it with a K, no matter how hard I try. They didn't say it. They didn't sing a K.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that too when I was listening to it again. I was like, wait a second, they said Ty, not Kai.
Yeah, right, right. Then right after the theme song, we're inside the boys' bunkhouse. Ted's in there, and Danny shows up for the first time. He and Ted have a secret handshake, and immediately there's this discussion of fry bread. And Danny talks about how his mother and his grandmother or whatever made the best fry bread. And he brought some for Ted, and immediately we get into this. His background, his heritage being part of his character. Then Melody comes in and they know Melody. Ted and Danny both talk about knowing her from the previous episode. Another thing, Danny's not in his like outfit.
His denim
I always
outfit.
think of him in yeah, the like gray t-shirt with the denim vest and the cowboy hat. He's in like a tie-dye t-shirt in that first scene. So that was interesting to see too, because whenever I think about the character, I think about him in that same outfit that he's in the opening credits. It's kind of similar to the Ernest outfit. I feel like Ernest P. Worrell wore a similar, not with a
Yeah.
cowboy hat, but similar sort of vest.
It's funny that you brought that up because I actually live pretty close to Montgomery Bell State Park in Tennessee, and that's the location where they have Ernest Day every year in early June. So we just missed it, but they have Ernest Day every year to celebrate Jim Barney's life and his character that he played, Ernest.
Oh wow, maybe I need to attend Ernest Day. I'm a big Ernest fan as well.
Same here, same here. So what else do we learn about Danny in this episode?
Danny says that Ted only cares about two things, one that wears tight jeans and the other horseshoes. That's kind of like gets you into the Ted character a little bit. Also a little bit about Danny too. Like Danny has this kind of friendly way of ribbing the other staff members, and
And it's never really too personal either.
he always is keeping it like pretty good natured. So and we get Buddy and Mr. Ernst arrive. They immediately kind of establish those characters, Mr. Ernst and the New York City accountant, and Buddy, the kid who wants to skateboard and do pranks and stuff and not be on a ranch in the middle of the American Southwest. He even says, "Can you take me to the video store to rent something really bloody?" I thought that was interesting for a kids show.
That might be the only
um,
time he ever said that because I don't remember him being a Gore fan.
right, right. Yeah, there's some comic book stuff later, but yeah, you're right.
So, what is the next big scene with Danny in it where we learn a lot about him?
There's this part where there's a wild horse that's been brought to the ranch to be broken for the ranch, and Ted really wants to ride the horse, and he's like looking at it, and then he runs out there to ride it, and Danny is stuck there with Brad, and he says, "Don't judge him until you get to know him," trying to help his friend out, being a wingman. And then when Ted runs out there, Danny says, "Well, once you get to know him, he's a real jerk," kind of, turning it around. But
Yeah.
again, it's kind of like Ted is a difficult personality, causing problems all the time. But it's clear that Danny cares about him. Then the best scenes in this, I thought, were the breaking in of the clothes. So right after this scene happens, Ted's like rolling around in the dirt. Danny pushes him out of the way, saves his life, and calls him an idiot. And then Mr. Ernst shows up and he's like, "Ted, why are you so covered in dirt?" And Danny has the idea to say that they're breaking in Ted's clothes, and then it gives Danny the opportunity to like push put dirt all over Ted's clothes, and Mr. Ernst is very interested. All of this is new to him, so he believes it, which is played for comedy. Like he wants Ted and Danny to break in his clothes, and there's a later scene where the same sort of thing results in Ted falling into a water trough for time number two, and Danny getting to splash the water on him because Mr. Ernst shows up, and he says that's the second part of breaking in the clothes.
Yeah. So, getting them dirty and then getting them wet. I see. What else?
A couple other scenes with Danny that I wanted to talk about is right after the second instance of Ted trying to ride this wild horse. Danny says, "If I had $1 for every one you owed me," because Ted says, "I owe you one," "I'd be a rich man." And I thought that was a nice sort of callback to, these guys have known each other for a long time and are pretty close. Danny tolerates Ted, puts up with his antics and whatnot. And then there are a lot of good scenes between Joe Torres and David Brisbane, Danny Lightfoot, and Mr. Ernst.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the episode, there's a scene where Mr. Ernst is sitting there and he's got blisters all over his feet from trying to wear cowboy boots. And he's got some horse hoof dressing that he's looking at and thinking of putting on his feet. And Danny walks over and he asks Danny if he thinks he should do it. And Danny basically says, I wouldn't, it might burn. And then walks off, again, imparting this wisdom to Mr. Ernst. Mr. Ernst doesn't really follow Danny's advice and immediately pours the Burton's hoof dressing on his foot and then screams in pain. And then the credits roll. And that's how the first episode of Hey Dude ends. I think there's another thing from that other podcast. I think there might have been a pilot, and I think it might not have David Lascher in it. But again, that's
Really?
just something that I heard in passing on that podcast, and I've never seen a Hey Dude pilot before.
I wonder if the reason that we haven't seen the pilot is because at those times, the pilot was really just used to get the green light from the executives on the project. I think nowadays we probably do see the pilots because they realize they can make money on them as the first episodes, but I wonder if it was different back then.
I think that makes sense.
Horse hoof dressing is an actual thing, by the way, for horses. So another thing we needed to talk about was some of the rumors regarding the whereabouts of Joe Torres, who played Danny Lightfoot. I know that you had mentioned something that was vaguely familiar with me regarding the Golden Nugget. So tell us what you know about that and if you think it's plausible.
Absolutely. So the first place I heard this, honestly, was in that IMDb thread that you mentioned last time about the meet and greet tour that we had kind of proposed that led to this initial idea that maybe Joe Torres' location was unknown. And this is 2007 from a blog, Joe Torres, Where Is He Now? And I thought it was interesting because the initial section mentions, well, it mentions a couple of things. One, it mentions a Wikipedia entry devoted to Joe Torres, which if you click on it is gone. But then it says the Wikipedia entry says that he was last spotted in a Tucson bar called the Golden Nugget. And again, this is a place that is a real bar in Tucson. We'll get into it a little more, but I think it still exists. I think it's now called the Nugget based on my attempt at researching this, but I think it's still around. But it's kind of like the car salesman thing that we hinted at last week. It's a definitive story about Joe Torres, and there's at least some element of truth. There is this place in Tucson, and the show is filmed near Tucson, so sort of makes a little bit of sense. And then there is another one that came up on Tumblr, 2012, and this person claims that they reached out to the manager of the Golden Nugget, Tim Donaldson. And that's a name, if you Google it with Golden Nugget, you can find that is a real person that is or was the manager of the Golden Nugget.
Oh, that's
But
cool.
this person could have found that out by doing the same searches, right?
Yeah.
In 2012. But they claim to have gotten in touch with this Tim Donaldson, and Tim Donaldson told them that Jose is alive and well, thanked him for his message, and said he would pass it along to him. And that's all there was. There was no follow-up that I could find from this person on the message being passed on. So it's really just, at this point, still basically a rumor. I want to talk about a little bit of the other things from the comments on this first blog. But first, I mean, the Golden Nugget thing, it's a rumor. This is a place that I believe still exists. I don't know if Tim Donaldson is still managing the Nugget or the Golden Nugget, but this is at least an area where it's a real place, real person that we can attempt to get in touch with and get an answer as to whether this was ever true. Is Jose Torres still a regular customer at the Nugget? Is it just made up? Does this person not remember ever having this exchange? That sort of thing. So I think this is the first of our rumors that is worth following up on.
So how long ago did this supposedly happen?
July 29, 2011. So almost 13 years ago.
Dang. Well, I just searched for this Tim Donaldson guy on LinkedIn, and there is a Tim Donaldson who is the owner of the Golden Nugget.
He still calls it the Golden Nugget.
Yeah, so it says he was a bartender from 81 to 2004 who then bought it in 2005 and still owns
Mhm.
it. He has some endorsements, so I don't think this person is fake.
Do you have the ability, do you have the capability to message this person on LinkedIn
I
right now?
do. I do. So I will shoot him a message and first confirm if he actually knows Joe Torres or not. And then if he does, I will see if he wants to come on the podcast and talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's fine. And like, that gives him the opportunity to, if he checks his LinkedIn, some people just don't check LinkedIn. I found that,
Yeah, that's me.
and yeah. But if he checks his LinkedIn, that gives him an opportunity to say, yeah, it's true, but no, I'm not comfortable talking about it. Something like that, where we can get a little something out of him.
Yeah, that's true.
The Golden Nugget rumor, it kind of ties into this, being a regular at a bar. We talked about the alcoholism stuff last time, which could be made up, but possibly not. No one knows. I wanted to talk about also some of the comments on that 2007 blog post. And one of them, someone says, again, this is in August of 2009. Sorry, this is a couple years after the post. He says, "My name is D.A. Literal, Litteral. So if you
Okay.
look up, there's a David A. Literal, who was a second unit director on Hey Dude. And that's exactly what this person says. I was the assistant director on the first 26 episodes of Hey Dude. I was also a staff writer. He says, I wrote the Take Me to Your Leader episode in which the gang thinks the ranch is being invaded by aliens. Joe Torres, and importantly, he calls him Joe, doesn't call him Jose, is very much alive, living in Tucson, and works for a AA property rental firm. Now, again, this is just someone on the internet, but they found an actual name of a person who worked on Hey Dude, and they claimed to be that person. They built an account saying they're that person, and they said a realistic sounding thing, right? I mean, they works for an AA property rental firm. It's not an outlandish thing like some abducted by aliens or some of the stuff we talked about last time. So potentially that or the car salesman can be our second dive into where he is. But going back to the golden nugget for a minute, a couple of the comments to this responding to the 2007 post, which is the earliest reference I could find to the golden nugget and Joe Torres, but I don't think it's the first mention of it because I think I remember it from prior to this. Um, but there are a couple of comments that say Joe or Jose Torres is a regular at the Golden Nugget. It doesn't make it true, but it's interesting that there are multiple people on the internet claiming to be able to confirm that he's a regular. And one person says, "I shoot pool with him weekly." They act like they know him,
Possible.
and he comes to the Golden Nugget all the time. Sort of could tie into what you said before about someone named Joe or Jose Torres, who is not the actual actor who portrayed Danny and is sort of like claiming that to people at a bar in Tucson. I don't know how likely that is, but that's at least something we'd have to consider as well if the people on the internet are telling the truth, which is not another big if.
Yeah, something too. I mean, it could be both of these are true. I mean, he could work at this AA properties place
Yes,
and go to the Golden Nugget often and
yes.
play pool at this bar. And, it may not be that hard to find him at all. We may stumble upon several different truths early on and find out a lot. But these are
Maybe, but
some,
again, the dates of this stuff, 2007 is when this, and 2000, the AA property management thing, 2009, the original post, 2007. So even if this were maybe true in 2009, it may not be true 15 years later.
yeah. So that is it for this episode. The next episode, we will follow up on our progress to reach out to the owner of the Golden Nugget to see if there are any nuggets of truth to Joe Torres being a regular there. Haha. I'll also say we really appreciate the positive feedback that we've been receiving about the podcast. We will try to share some of that in future episodes. And as always, if you have any clues on the whereabouts of Danny Lightfoot, please email us at findingdannylightfoot@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.